Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So one of my favorite devices, the RGB10 Max, has recently got a facelift. This is the RGB10 Max 2. Now, the upgrades in this device are purely cosmetic. There are no changes to the internal performance at all. But I think that the evolution of this controller from the original to this one is quite significant. You'll see immediately that it has more ergonomic controls, and thankfully, this is the first device with this chipset that has stacked shoulder and trigger buttons, and they're a welcome change. On top of that, PowKiddy has made a couple other tweaks. For example, they've upgraded this D-pad, and they've also included new face buttons. And both of these are significantly better than any device they've ever made before. Now, the elephant in the room is that this device runs an RK3326 chipset, and at this point, this is probably the 11th or 12th device to come out in the past 2 years with this chipset. So if you already own a device with this chipset, I'm not going to argue that you need to get rid of that one and upgrade it to this one. Instead, I'm more interested in observing just some of the changes and evolution that have happened with devices within this space. Because I do think, among all of those devices with this chipset, this one's probably the best. The original RGB10 Max was my favorite device of this chipset, but I can tell you now that I like this one better. So to me that means a lot, and that's what I want to focus on in this video, is to tell you all the little things that they made changes to and upgrades to that make this one even better than the previous. Of course, it's not without faults, and I've got plenty of those to show off as well, but all the same, I think that you're going to be in for a treat if this is going to be your first retro handheld device. Either way, let's spend a few minutes going over some of the hardware and software available for this device and see whether or not it's a good fit for you. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so here it is. There are 3 different colors available. There's a black with white buttons, this white version, as well as one that's called Rosé. First impressions right out of the gate is the plastic shell that they used is very different than the original RGB10 Max. This is a hard plastic with a little bit of texture to it. And the matte texture on this device doesn't seem to pick up fingerprints, and I do think this is going to be a nice long-term case. Second impression is, man, I really love these trigger buttons. They feel really nice and responsive. They're very obviously copied from the Nintendo Switch, and I really like them. Unfortunately, the shoulder buttons are not quite as balanced or easy to press on as the trigger buttons. They seem to work the best when you press on them from the edges or from the sides. When you try to press down on them from the top down, it takes a little bit more effort to click down, and they don't spring back as much as I'd like. They're not terrible, but they do not compare to how great these new triggers are. So a huge win when it comes to the triggers, and the shoulder buttons are adequate. Up top, the I/O remains the same. Power button, reset, Wi-Fi switch, charging cable, audio jack, OTG cable, SD card, and volume buttons. On the bottom you have 2 speaker grills, but like with the RGB10 Max, this is only a mono speaker on the right side. It's unfortunate because with a device this big, you would definitely be able to tell the stereo sound, and so it's a wasted opportunity. The D-pad itself has gotten an upgrade. I think that the rubber membranes that they have underneath the D-pad are either a little bit thicker or a little bit more resistant. Either way, the D-pad has really good travel and pivot. Diagonals on this work really naturally. This is a really good D-pad. When you press down on the D-pad, it doesn't sit flush with the device, which makes it feel really tactile and responsive. Here's a real-world example. As you can see here in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I'm throwing fireballs with no problem. This is really cool. So overall, the D-pad is excellent. I would say it rivals Anbernic devices. As far as I can tell, the Nintendo Switch style analog sticks here are exactly the same as they've always been. And they're good, I have no issues with them. The start and select and function keys seem to stick out more than they usually do, and they are very clicky, but honestly, I don't mind that. I think that that's a pretty good thing when it comes to function buttons. So now let's take a minute and talk about the face buttons. These have gotten an upgrade as well. First thing I notice is that these buttons stick out quite a bit from the original RGB10 Max. When you push down on these buttons, they no longer sit anywhere near flush with the device itself. This is a really good thing for me. Now, unfortunately, due to their height, they have a little bit more play, like they wobble back and forth, just a little bit more than usual. But honestly, when you're actually playing a game, I don't notice this play at all. So now let's compare it against the original RGB10 Max shell. Now the I/O up top seems to be a little bit more condensed and streamlined in the RGB Max 2, and I think it's a good thing. It looks really good on this device. And I do like that the volume buttons are now individual buttons instead of a rocker on the original RGB10 Max. But overall, not a huge difference between these in the top. And on the bottom, the speaker holes on the RGB10 Max are a little bit more condensed as well. Okay, now let's compare the face buttons. On the original RGB10 Max, the buttons just don't stick out as much as the new one does. And when you push down on them, they sit almost flush with the device. And that doesn't happen with the Max 2. On the Max 2, the names of the buttons are actually on the buttons themselves, and they also have a little bit different of a texture. The RGB10 Max originally had very smooth buttons, but on the Max 2, they are definitely more textured and a little bit grippy. And initially I thought I wasn't going to like this, but it turns out I really like this. These are really nice feeling buttons. So now let's take a look at the D-pad. Unlike with the face buttons, the travel on the D-pad isn't quite that different. As you can see, when you push down on the D-pad on the original Max, it still sticks out quite a bit from the case. And that seems to be about the same with the Max 2, maybe it's a tiny fraction higher, but overall, almost the exact same amount of travel. The real difference is how springy the Max 2 is compared to the original. And like with the face buttons, the D-pad also has that new texture, and when you compare it directly against the original Max, it makes its predecessor feel very slick and amateurish. Now comparing this with an Anbernic device, this is the RG351P, this one also has a textured D-pad. But I'd say the texture on the RGB Max 2 is quite a bit more than the Anbernic one. And again, this is not something I was expecting to like, but I ended up really liking it. It just feels a little bit more grippy when I'm using it. I like it. In terms of D-pad sizes, these are all three almost identical, a little bit shy of 22 millimeters. So when it comes to the size of the D-pad, they're the same. But that's not really the case with the face buttons. The face buttons on the RGB10 Max and the Max 2 are nearly a millimeter smaller than the ones on the Anbernic device. And when it comes to retro handheld devices, I prefer larger buttons. I just kind of like that chunkiness, and so because of that, the Anbernic buttons are quite a bit better than the PowKiddy ones when it comes to the size and the feel altogether. And that's not to say that the RGB10 Max button sizes are terrible. In fact, they are very similar to what you would find on the Nintendo Switch. When you compare it side by side with the Joy-Con, you can see that they're just about the same size, although it does look like the Max 2 is a little bit more spread out. And sure enough, when you measure them, you can see the RGB Max 2 has about a millimeter more of spread between the buttons altogether. But when it comes to the button sizes, they are just about the same. So all in all, if you've ever used a Nintendo Switch before, you're going to be comfortable using these buttons too. They're a little bit on the small side, but they're not breaking any records here. Of course, the feel of the buttons are completely different. The Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons have a clicky micro switch feel to them, and these have a rubber membrane feel. And I honestly like the conductive rubber feel better. Okay, let's talk about ergonomics for a bit. These have this flared back to them now, and it's actually kind of nice. Initially, I was worried that I was going to have too much space at the bottom of the device to feel comfortable. For example, if I put my index and middle fingers against the back of the device, there's not a lot of space for my other two fingers. But as soon as I picked up the device, I realized that the natural place for my index fingers is actually up on the triggers themselves. This is a more comfortable way of feeling it. And by doing that, your middle and ring fingers naturally are just going to cup around the rest of the device. So really, the only fingers that aren't going to grip the device are going to be your pinkies, and honestly, I think it's actually a pretty comfortable fit. The way you hold something like the RGB10 Max is completely different. You would actually just spread your fingers across the back of it like this. And that's because you wouldn't naturally want to put your index fingers on top of the shoulder and trigger buttons on the original RGB10 Max. But on the Max 2, as your index fingers just naturally go to the top like that, it gives you a lot more space to work with. It's a very comfortable handheld. Previous to this device, the RK3326 device that I thought was the most comfortable was this one here, the Qi Game Force. And this one was flared up on top, which allowed you to have a space to put your index fingers. And so naturally, you had a good place to put your hands. But the device had all sorts of other shortcomings. For example, the face buttons had a lot of play to them. The display is not OCA laminated, and it doesn't have stacked shoulder buttons. All in all, I can say that the way they've designed the RGB Max 2 is very comfortable. This is the most comfortable 5-inch handheld I've ever used. And it turns out that when playing the device, the way that the shoulder buttons are situated are not so bad because you are going to press against the edges of the button and not top down. And so in that sense, I didn't have any issues pressing down on the shoulder buttons. Okay, let's talk a little bit about software. We're going to start up with the stock firmware that comes with this device. We'll do a quick boot test, and as you can see, it takes about 34 seconds to boot from start to finish. So I've seen some controversy about the software experience of this device. Let's talk about that for a second. What it comes down to is the theme that they chose to represent the modified version of Emulec on this stock firmware contains some suggestive imagery, as well as a section that might lead you to believe that there's adult entertainment on this device. But it isn't. This is actually just Chinese TV broadcasts streamed over the internet. And I'm not connected to the internet, that's why you're not seeing any of these broadcasts. I think when it comes down to it, the company just didn't do good quality control or attention to detail when it came to the theme itself. Either way, since this came to light, PowKiddy has reached out and said that they have fixed this on all future orders. And yeah, to be honest, the suggestion of adult material on a handheld device never even occurred to me before I got this device, so that kind of sucks. And it's actually pretty easy to fix if you do get a device that does have this section, so let me show you how to change that real quick. Probably the easiest thing you can do is actually just go into the main menu and go into UI settings and then change the themes. So any of these other themes will not have that logo on their section. For example, with this one here, if you scroll over to the media player section, you can now see it just shows the media player. And so all the other themes are going to work nicely too. And so this is probably the easiest way to fix it, is to just change your theme. Later in the video, I'll also show you how to just get rid of that section altogether. Okay, now let's compare screens. Now, one of the complaints that I had about the original RGB10 Max was that the screen wasn't quite as bright as I would have liked. It was by no means unplayable, but at the same time, it was noticeably more dim than most of the other devices I own. And while it's hard to capture on video like this, I will say that this screen is significantly more brighter than the original. In fact, I would say it's on par or a little bit brighter than a lot of the other devices I already own. Now, the original RGB10 Max here on the bottom is actually running the RetroOS firmware, which has a kernel update that does make the screen a little bit brighter. But even then, the RGB10 Max 2 still has a much brighter screen. And when you swap them out and put the RetroOS firmware on the RGB Max 2, it gets even brighter. And with this setup, I think it is pretty easy to tell how bright this screen is. Even compared to something like the RG351MP on the top right, you can just see how bright the whites are in it. And I'll admit the video here does look a little bit washed out, but that's not the experience I have in real life. In fact, if anything, I find it to be brighter and more saturated than the RG351MP. So when it comes down to it, I think this is a big improvement when it comes to the screen quality. Color balance also seems to be really good. Okay, so back on the stock firmware, one thing I want to talk about is the screen itself. So this is a 16:9 5-inch display, which means that when you play 4:3 content, it's not going to take up the whole screen. But as you can see here, they've preloaded a bunch of bezels for all the systems, and they actually look pretty nice. The RetroOS firmware does the same thing, and so in that sense, I really do like the experience of playing 4:3 games on this device. And when it comes to responsiveness of controls and just the overall feel, it's really good. This is a really nice experience. The ergonomics plus the feel of the buttons and the nice bright screen all come together to have a really nice experience. Okay, so let's talk about the stock firmware experience for a bit. Now, aside from the controversy of the theme itself, this is probably one of the best software images I've seen come preloaded on a retro handheld device. So let's pull it out and take a look at what's inside. First thing, let me show you how to get rid of that media player section in case you don't want to have that showing up on your device. All you have to do is just go into the EEROMs partition, and then find the mPlayer folder, and then delete all of these files inside. These are just M3U files that connect to Chinese TV broadcasts. So it's as simple as just deleting out these files, and now you won't see that section when you boot up the device. And additionally, here is the folder structure of all the game files that are preloaded onto this SD card. So say you open up one of these, like the Mega Drive one, you'll see that on top of the typical Genesis games they have here, they also have a subfolder for Japanese and Brazilian games. And so when it comes to preloaded SD cards, this is fairly well made. Now, that being said, the use of preloaded SD cards is super shady. You know, these companies should not be loading these things up with copyrighted content. And so because of that, I actually always recommend that you build your own ROM library and load that up yourself. And I have an RGB10 Max starter guide, which would apply to this device as well. All the same, even though I don't recommend it, if you are looking for a device that comes preloaded with a bunch of games, this one seems to be the best organized of the ones I've seen so far. And so if you're in a situation where you don't have access to a computer to build your own ROM library or to flash new firmware, the out-of-box experience of the RGB10 Max 2 is probably one of the best I've seen. Okay, so now let's try out some of the custom firmwares that I've used on the RGB10 Max previously. This card here has RetroOS on it, one of my favorite custom firmwares. Let's load it up. And sure enough, it boots up just fine. In fact, everything works fine except for the analog controls. for some reason they're swapped, so left is right and up is down. And in some contexts, this is actually pretty easy to change. For example, if you go into RetroArch and into the input section, you can remap the analog controls. You only have to do this one time. And basically all you're doing now is just teaching RetroArch that up is down and down is up, and it's going to remember that. After you've made those changes, go back to the main section, go to configuration file, and save current configuration. Now, anytime you use the analog stick in any RetroArch based emulator, it's going to work just fine. So that's a pretty easy fix. That being said, if you use the stock operating system, it's already been pre-configured for you. You don't have to do that extra step unless you're using custom firmware like RetroOz. And some of the other standalone emulators, for example, here's PSP running on Emulec 4.3. You can just go in here and remap your analog controls as well. And just like that, it's going to work fine. That being said, there are several games and ports which you cannot actually go in and change the controls yourself. A good example would be Super Mario 64. Unfortunately, this port is completely broken right now on RetroOz because of the inverted controls. That being said, the D-pad works just fine, so if you have any ports like the Sonic the Hedgehog port that uses the D-pad controls, you're not going to have any problems. Same thing with games like Shovel Knight. So really, if you want to use RetroOz, you just have to basically go through and remap the analog controls for the emulators that support it. In some standalone ports, like for example the LZ Doom port on RetroOz, which will allow you to play Doom mods and hacks, it allows you to go in and change your analog settings just there on the fly, and so because of that you can play this just fine. And honestly, this one is a joy to play. Those stacked triggers really do feel great on this. So if you're a big fan of Doom or any other first-person shooters that can play on this device, you're going to have a really great time with these stacked triggers. So the original RGB10 Max had some issues with the left side of the screen getting really hot, and this does still happen on this device as well. There is no heat shielding on this device, and so because of that, the left side of the screen and even the back side of this part here, it does get warm. And I'm not sure if this is going to damage the screen over time, but I am worried about what it's going to look like 5 years from now. Then again, in 5 years, we're going to have a handheld PS5 player, and we probably won't need this thing anyway. Okay, a couple other observations. So the LCD light that's on the right of the screen here is actually a little bit better than it was previously. It seems to be a little bit more muted and more balanced. That being said, when you charge the device in, the color doesn't really change. It gets a tiny little bit more orange, but it's almost indiscernible. Okay, let's talk about light bleeding for a bit. This actually does a really good job when containing the light from the screen. Here it is at max brightness, and the only light bleeding I can see is at the very top left of the corner. You can see just a tiny speck of light. Other than that, the only other bleeding I could see is out of the speaker hole. Altogether, this is a really well contained device. Okay, so one of my favorite things about the original RGB10 Max was using it as a game streamer. And so let's spend a few minutes talking about game streaming on this device. And all in all, the streaming experience is quite a bit improved. The ergonomics and stacked trigger buttons just make this a delight to play. Now that being said, the analog controls are also reversed when you try to stream games, and so until they build a new RetroOz profile, you're going to be SOL when it comes to certain games that don't allow you to adjust the analog controls. But for the most part, if you want to stream an emulator from your PC, for example here's Dolphin running Metroid Prime on the GameCube, this one works just great because I'm able to reverse the analog controls within the settings menu. And playing games like this with these stacked triggers is just a joy. This is so much better of an experience than it was on the previous RGB10 Max, which honestly already was a pretty good experience, so this is just that much better. Altogether, if you're looking for streaming from your couch or within your home, for $125 and a 5-inch display, this might be the best experience you can buy in this price range. Okay, so wrapping things up here with the RGB Max 2, I think this is quite an improvement over the original RGB10 Max. There's just a lot of little things that I think are really welcome changes. For example, I didn't really like the rubbery feel of the original Max, and the Max 2 now has this matte, hard plastic feel. It feels really good. The D-pad is now textured and more responsive, the face buttons stick out a little bit more and also have a nice texture to them. And of course these stacked shoulder and trigger buttons are really good. The triggers themselves are a joy to press, and honestly the shoulder buttons aren't the best, but they still work really well. And of course when it comes to ergonomics, this is a very comfortable device to hold. Quite a bit more comfortable than any other device within this price range. Despite some significant blunders when it comes to the operating system, the custom firmware image that they're using on this device is actually fairly plug and play. So all things considered, if you're in the market for your very first retro handheld device, I think this is probably a good device to choose from, as long as you're okay with playing games from the PS1 era and below. If you're more interested in PSP and Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and maybe some GameCube, then I would recommend waiting until the next generation of handheld devices. I think in the next few months we're going to have a lot of other choice when it comes to more powerful systems, and hopefully they'll take some of the design choices that have been made here by PowKiddy and implement them with a more powerful chipset. I'm excited to see where this community goes as they make these incremental improvements over the next year or so. That being said, if you already own an RK3326 device and you're relatively happy with it, then I don't think there's any reason to upgrade to this device. As great as it is, I can't imagine paying $125 just to have a little bit better ergonomics. But if you've got a retro handheld device and its shortcomings are preventing you from really enjoying it, then maybe this might be something to consider. It's not going to win awards when it comes to raw performance power, but all the same, this is a well-built device that has solid performance for what it does. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a device you're now considering? Or if this is your first device, are you going to hold out for something like the Ein Odin or the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus? Either way, I'm interested to see what you think. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!